Chapter 31. Patrick had worked hard to develop the courage to really visit his daughter. He wasn't sure what he'd say when he saw her or what would happen, but his heart was the legs that led him to Matthew's place. He hesitated at the door for a while before he rang the doorbell, fidgeting nervously with his fingers. He waited for less than a minute before he saw the door open. Matthew stood before him, sporting a deep scowl. "What are you doing here, and what the hell do you want?" he sneered bitterly, and Patrick swallowed hard under the intensity of his gaze. "I came to see Kaylyn," he provided firmly. Matthew huffed out a mirthless laugh. "You people really have some nerve, don't you?" he asked in disbelief. "Matthew, please. I'm not here to cause trouble," he told him. "Kaylyn doesn't want to see you. She has been through enough," he grounded out between tightly clenched teeth. Patrick released a defeated sigh, knowing that he was right, but still he wanted to make amends before it was too late. "Please. I just want to talk to my daughter," he pleaded gently, and Matthew rose a brow at the soft tone in the man's voice. He had known the Fishers professionally for quite some time in his business life, and in all those years he had never taken Patrick Fisher for a frail man, but now he looked like the epitome of frail. His face carried moonlight paleness and his eyes were in a hole with hair Matthew thought looked too thin. He could see the desperation in the old man's features as his eyes held an undeniable plea that would make the devil himself feel sorry for him. Matthew shifted to one side of the door, allowing him entrance. The smile that graced Patrick's face was one of pure gratefulness. As he entered, he immediately moved to sit on the sofa. "Can you go get her for me, please?" he asked a bit shakily. Matthew's brows furrowed as he watched the old man rest his elbows to his knees, placing his palms on his forehead. Without saying another word to him, Matthew strolled off to find Kaylyn. He paused at her room door, a bit curious about the silence that was in her room. The door was closed, but he could hear no shuffling or any movements. He immediately knocked on her door, placing his ear to the door to hear something. When Matthew heard nothing, he feared the worst as his heart began to plummet in his chest. He feared she could be lying unconscious in the room or bleeding out or something. Without further hesitation, Matthew burst open the door, even though it was not closed. He entered with a stumble, immediately pausing when his eyes began to feast on the object in the bed. Kaylyn laid there, curled up in a little bundle, with her red hair creating a golden halo around her head. Matthew moved closer as he assessed her with intent curiosity. He noticed that she was shirtless and that the only thing covering her top was a bra that only perked up her firm breasts, and oh, did he remember their firmness. Matthew shook his head almost immediately, mentally scolding himself for the direction in which his thoughts had decided to take him. He still couldn't quite resist looking at her little baby bump. Matthew smiled, taking great satisfaction in the fact that he was parent to the life inside Kaylyn. He wanted to touch it, he really wanted to, but instead he smiled, took a blanket and covered her with it. He watched as she snuggled in its warmness and he laughed lightly, seeing how really beautiful the woman was without the weight of the world on her shoulders. Instinctively, he bent over and placed a kiss on her forehead before he left the room. He wasn't going to wake her up only to talk to the old man, and so he'd have to wait. As Matthew reached the top of the stairs to go back down, his phone shrilled in his pocket. Pulling it out, he immediately brought it to his ear when he saw that it was Jason. "Hey man, I'm running a bit late. How about I come for dinner?" Jason immediately explained and asked in one go. Matthew sighed, scratching his head. "Yeah, that's fine. Dinner is at 5, he provided, a bit relieved that Jason was late, because he would have some things to clear up with Patrick. "Okay, great. See you then," he beamed cheerfully before hanging up. Matthew sighed before descending the stairs. He went down to find Patrick still on the sofa, staring blankly at the wall. Matthew's brows knitted in curiosity. Something was up with the man. Moving over to sit at the opposite side of him, he paused, remembering he had not offered him a drink. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, and Patrick immediately nodded. "A glass of water would be great," he smiled faintly, and Matthew nodded, immediately moving to grant his request. Patrick took a hearty swallow when Matthew handed him the glass filled with water. He nodded his thanks when he placed it on the small coffee table. "Where's Kaylyn?" he asked now, looking around the room. "She's asleep. I won't wake her," Matthew stated as he took a seat, carefully assessing the man. He nodded in comprehension. "She was my best friend at one point, you know," he smiled. Matthew's brow shot up in surprise, but his face still held its firmness. "And I guess you did something to screw that up," he said, knowing that he was being rude, but he held no respect for the man or his wife. "Yes, I did," Patrick managed a mirthless laugh. "I messed up pretty badly." Matthew's curiosity piqued. "What did you do to her?" he couldn't resist asking. Patrick was a bit hesitant. He knew that Mayhew cared for his daughter, but could he trust him with information as important as the one he pondered on telling him? He cleared his throat. "When Kaylyn left college some years ago, Lilith and I were out to a banquet that was being hosted by our good family friend and business partner," he began. "Kaylyn told us that she wouldn't come because she was never a fan of fancy dresses and high heels," he exclaimed, and Matthew couldn't resist the smile that quirked up at his lips. "She stayed home, and when we got back home..." Patrick trailed off, taking another gulp of the water. Matthew wanted to ask if he wanted a refill, but he was more interested in hearing what Patrick had to say. "What happened?" he pressed, looking at the zoned-out face of Fisher. "Kaylyn met us at the door with a distraught look on her face. She was crying and hugging her shoulders tightly while her body trembled. We asked her what was wrong, but she was crying uncontrollably for quite some time. When she finally got a hold of herself, she told us that James, he was the son of our business friend, had tried to rape her." Patrick used his hand to wipe his mouth. "What?" Matthew hissed. "We didn't find James at the house, and we had always known the immense hate that Kaylyn always carried for the guy. She hated him with a passion, and so when she told us, Lilith immediately thought that she was lying." He shook his head. "James was always a nice boy." "So you believed him over your own daughter?" Matthew snarled angrily. "We didn't have any evidence of Kaylyn's alleged assault. James' butler said he was in his room all night." "Tell me. How far away did this James live from you?" Matthew asked sternly. "He lived next door," Patrick provided. Matthew snorted in disbelief. "And didn't you think that when Kaylyn got free of him and ran towards the door, didn't you think that it would have given James enough time to..." "I picked up on that sometime later. Lilith was headstrong on painting Kaylyn the liar. She said she had concocted a wicked lie, and when Kaylyn went to accuse James with tears running down her face, Lilith told her she was a disgrace to the family and its reputation. Kaylyn left home the following week. Lilith was happy to see her leave. I don't know what happened to my Kaylyn when she left. Lilith made sure that her name would not be considered for any job she might have sought for the first 2 years." A tear slipped from his eyes. Matthew listened in shock. "What kind of a effing man are you?" he spat in a disgusted tone. "Do you have a PSSY beneath you, Fisher?" he growled. "I had no say in the matter. I only married the rich woman. Lilith held all the control. Once her mind was made up, that was that," he explained. "So you let her go without a fight? When you're married to a woman like Lilith, all you can do is watch from the sidelines," he breathed out shakily. "I have a good mind throwing you out of my house right now," Matthew threatened crisply. Patrick held his hands up. Mayhew, I'm dying. I need to talk to my daughter, he pleaded. Like I give a FCK. Matthew sneered, angered by the man's cowardice and lack of bravado. Matthew watched as Patrick's gaze shifted from him to settle behind. Kaylyn, honey, Patrick said softly. Matthew's head snapped around, his blood running cold when he saw Kaylyn standing behind with tears streaming down her face, while her body trembled violently. Chapter 32. A few minutes in her sleep, Kaylyn woke up to find a blanket snugly wrapped around her. Curiosity got the better of her as she wondered who might have done it, but when she realized that Matthew was the only other person in the house, she paled. Her cheeks flamed with a blush when she again realized that she was only in a bra. Matthew had seen her. She thought in panic, suddenly using her hands to clasp her shoulders. Stiffly, Kaylyn moved from the bed and pulled on a shirt, before she decided to go to the bathroom. As she opened the door, she paused when she heard muttering downstairs. Curiosity got the better of her and she found herself wandering down the stairs, careful not to be heard. Kaylyn's breath hitched in her throat when she closed in on the voices and recognized them too well. For a moment, she couldn't move because her shock had paralyzed her, but as she listened, the numbness moved from her legs to her heart. Taking another step around the corner, her worst fears were confirmed when she saw her father having a conversation with Matthew. She listened as they spoke and the topic of the conversation brought back a feeling of nostalgia as she was forced to relive the happenings of years ago. Some things that she heard shocked her to the core because she did not know her mother was the one who prevented her from getting a job when she had left. She had found it strange at the time, when every business place she went turned her down. She didn't quite understand at the time, but this was revelation for her. Kaylyn's lips trembled as she listened further in the conversation and all the hurt she had felt during that phase threatened to topple her over. Her body trembled and her eyes watered, bursting the dam in her eyes which soon flooded her face. "Kaylyn, honey," Patrick exclaimed as he looked over Matthew's shoulders and at Kaylyn. Through her tear-blurred eyes, she was able to see the panic and fear on Matthew's face, and without hesitation he dashed from the sofa and to her side. As he stood before her, he carefully examined her face, his eyes then trailing along her body to see if she was hurt otherwise. Matthew swallowed hard, hating to see her tears. He had seen them too much over the past days and it increased his need to protect and never let her go. If he could take half her hurt onto himself, he would because he thought she had been through enough. Matthew pulled her into his arms like he had done the night before and used his hands to smoothen the top of her head. He felt the vibrations of her sobs on his chest and he held her tighter, wanting to take them away. "Kaylyn, honey," Patrick announced again from behind and Matthew's body stiffened, his veins pulsing with fire. Still holding Kaylyn to him, he spun around, his eyes shooting daggers at the old man. "Get out!" he growled between tightly clenched teeth, but Patrick didn't. He was determined to have a word with his daughter. He had never meant to cause her greater pain than the one she was going through, but all he needed was a few words. He didn't care if she threw him out, or never forgive him later, he just wanted to talk with his baby girl. Seeing the man's hesitance, Matthew grew more furious. It was like déjà vu for him because not long ago, he was having the same difficulty getting someone else from his house. He was not going to have that again. "Leave," he warned sternly for the second time, knowing that the third time would not come. "Kaylyn, honey, I just want to talk to you," Patrick begged, his hands outstretched to reach for her. Matthew slapped away his hand forcefully, causing Patrick to stumble, but he quickly regained his balance. "If you think you're going to put Kaylyn or my baby through another round of hell, you've got another thing coming, old man," he sneered, withdrawing himself from Kaylyn as he moved towards Patrick. "Please," Patrick began, but before he got the chance to finish his sentence, his collar was held captive by Matthew's strong hands. "I've had enough of you people," he angrily said, moving with Patrick towards the door to literally throw him out. He struggled, managing to escape Matthew's hold. "Please," he begged again, but the blow he received to the face stopped him in mid-sentence. Patrick fell to the floor, clutching his jaw as Mayhew moved down on him to throw another blow. There was nothing Patrick could do to stop it, and so he laid defeated, waiting for the moment when his jaw would receive pain close in comparison to the one in his heart. "Matthew, stop!" Kaylyn croaked out quickly just as Matthew elevated his hand to bring to Patrick's face. He paused and turned to look at her, his face questioning. Kaylyn shook her head, while she folded her lips. Seeing the look on her face, Matthew spared a glance at Patrick before he stood, flashing his hand to ease the ache in his fist. Kaylyn moved towards Patrick and held her hand out, indicating for him to take it so she could help him up. Patrick's face transformed from the pained expression and into a trembling smile. He took her hands, but he didn't allow her to struggle with the weight of him. As soon as his feet was leveled to the ground, he hugged her and Kaylyn tightly squeezed her eyes shut, not wanting to cry again. Patrick wrapped her arms around his daughter, holding her like she was dear life, and maybe she was, because Patrick had been a lifeless soul when his daughter left him. Kaylyn didn't raise her hands to return the hug, but she nevertheless allowed it. Matthew watched from the sidelines with his arms crossed, being the bodyguard for Kaylyn. When they broke apart, Kaylyn still crying, they both took a seat on the sofa. "Mayhew, can you give me some time with my daughter please?" Patrick asked pleadingly. Matthew glanced at Kaylyn for an answer, and when she nodded her head, he knew it was his cue to leave. "I'll just be in the other room if you need anything," he told her before he left. Patrick smiled, drinking in the sight of his long-lost treasure. His face still slightly throbbed from the blow he had received to his face earlier, but that was currently the least of his worries. He saw the tension on Kaylyn's face and he knew that was going to be the expected emotion, but he was going to try to do the best he could to lighten the situation. "How are you and the baby?" Patrick asked sincerely, wanting so much to know how they were. Kaylyn bit her lips and nodded. "Fine," was all she decided on saying, because she knew that further explanation would only cause her eyes to rain. Patrick nodded and smiled. Silence followed. "Where's Lilith?" Kaylyn asked, and then cleared her throat. Patrick slightly frowned, not wanting the subject of his wife to dampen the mood. "She's at home." "She couldn't make eye," Patrick began. "You don't have to defend her, we both know that she wouldn't come anyway," Kaylyn cut in flatly. Patrick hung his head. "Lilith still holds a grudge against you, Kaylyn, but I don't. I just wanted to talk to you and see you." He looked at her now, staring into her eyes. Kaylyn swallowed, fidgeting with her fingers with her eyes downcast. She didn't exactly know what to say, the feeling she was experiencing was too bittersweet. The silence that followed stretched into a minute without one saying a thing to the other, both being overwhelmed by the things they wanted to say, but what their lips failed to utter. "Kaylyn, I'm sorry," Patrick blurted out, causing Kaylyn's eyes to snap up to his. "I'm sorry for everything I have put you through. I'm sorry for not believing you at first. I'm sorry for making you leave without trying to stop you. I'm sorry for the heartache you experienced after," Patrick exclaimed shakily, reaching forward to grip Kaylyn's hand in his. A slight gasp escaped her lips, but she didn't try to pull her hands from his. Patrick fell to his knees, still clasping Kaylyn's hands as his lips trembled. "If I could turn back time I would, I never should have doubted you." He trailed off, tightly closing his eyes as the tears fell from his eyes. Kaylyn sucked her lips, not wanting to cry again. "Kaylyn, I'm not saying this. I'm not coming forward now because I'm dying. I've been meaning to do this for a long time, and maybe the prospect of death gave me some courage, but please, you've got to believe that this is coming from my heart," he cried, using his hand to gently massage Kaylyn's. Kaylyn sniffed. "Dad. Please, just hear me out first," he begged before continuing. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, I'm just asking for an ear so you can hear me out. I just want some time with you, that's all I'm asking for," Patrick pleaded softly. "Dad. Just some time. I just want some time to make up for everything. I will spend the rest of my days apologizing for not being the father that I should have been, but I just need some time to do so, please," he exclaimed, looking up at Kaylyn, who was silently crying. "Dad," she tried to say again, wanting to assure him that all was fine, but Patrick thought it was an interruption for him to shut up. "I have been a coward and I hate myself for being such a person. I hate myself for doing the things I've done over the years." He trailed off and began coughing. "Dad, it's fine," Kaylyn quickly told him, with an undeniable shakiness to her tone. He looked up and managed a smile and was about to say something when he began to cough again. "Kaylyn, He once again trailed off as he went into another fit of coughing. Kaylyn cried, clutching his shoulders to look upon his face. "Dad, what's happening?" she asked, panicked, and the only reply she got from him was more coughing as his body slightly trembled. Kaylyn could feel the blood draining from her face as she looked at Patrick. "Matthew!" she screeched loudly, her eyes wide with hysteria. Chapter 33. Matthew dashed quickly to the sitting room where she was, his heart throbbing with the prospect of her being hurt. He brought himself to a sudden halt, slightly sliding on the floor as his line of vision settled on what was happening before him. Kaylyn's face was panic-stricken as tears poured down her face in buckets. Her face was red, her mouth agape and her body trembling. Matthew's blood ran cold at the sight. For a moment his world stopped and the only images that presented themselves were that of Kaylyn's face and the horror that was etched on her features. Matthew's eyes momentarily diverted from Kaylyn and to the source of her tears. His eyes slightly widened because he was only just noticing the old man. He had thought that Kaylyn was the one hurt, but now as Matthew watched he realized that Patrick presented the problem. I don't know what's happening," Kaylyn sobbed. Matthew stood there for a brief moment before his brain finally seemed to click. He didn't know what the problem with Patrick was, but Matthew found himself moving towards the kitchen. Quickly he poured a glass of room-temperature water, before returning to the living room. Kaylyn, with trembling hands, took it from him and managed a small smile before she handed it to Patrick, whose coughing fit seemed to have lessened by a tad. He took slow sips, drinking between coughs as his eyes glued to his daughter. Patrick, amidst the burning in his throat, found comfort in the fact that his daughter still cared for him. He could see it in her eyes and he had found the evidence in her tears. Seeing her cry was the last thing he intended on doing, but it also served as a voice for the words that she couldn't say aloud. "It's okay, Kaylyn, I'm fine now," he assured in a hoarse tone, using his fingers to wipe the tears that flowed from her eyes. Kaylyn choked out a laugh as relief flooded her form. She looked up at Matthew, the glee shining above the saddened expression that was once present. Matthew returned the smile as he watched the exchange of father and daughter. When all was settled and back to normal, they all seated themselves on the sofa, the silence a bit awkward and deafening, even though hearts were in joyous chaos. Patrick turned to Kaylyn and held her hands once more, making sure to wear a smile on his pale lips. "Kaylyn, we all know that life has a start and an end, but what counts most is what we do in between those two phases. My life really began when I held you in my arms for the very first time." He trailed off as a grin cracked his face. I fell in love with you right away, even though you were crying profusely, wanting to be in your mother's arms," he laughed, and Kaylyn smiled, thinking of the irony. "I did the wrong thing by letting you go, and I believe a part of me got lost too. I didn't have an in-between because I had already met my end at the time." Patrick knew he was blabbering on incessantly. The pace in which his mouth was moving was too slow for the amount of thoughts he had to let out. He sighed, trying to summarize it all up. "I have only a few months left here. Maybe less." He ignored Kaylyn's gasp, trying his best to not meet her eyes. "Terminal cancer," he informed flatly. "There's no cure, but the doctors have placed me on palliative chemotherapy to lessen the symptoms and prolong my life for a bit." He choked out a mirthless laugh. "Dad!" Kaylyn began shakily, but Patrick quickly turned his head to hers, slowly shaking his head. "Don't cry, sweetheart, it's fine. I'm fine. I have you now, I have found you, and that's all that matters." He squeezed her hands gently, before pulling in her for a hug. Matthew watched, shocked at the man's confession. Cancer, he found it hard to believe, even though the frailness in his form was undeniable. He suddenly felt a pang of guilt when he thought back to how he had handled the man just moments ago. Swallowing hard, Matthew hung his head to conceal his shame. "Don't worry about me now, honey. Focus on the life you're carrying inside of you," Patrick added, once he withdrew himself from his daughter's embrace. Kaylyn managed a faint smile, and then cleared her throat. "Does Lilith know?" she asked with a stronger tone. Patrick shook his head. "I haven't told her. She doesn't seem to even realize that I'm not as strong as before." He smiled with a heavy sigh, before getting up from the sofa. "Well, I've got to go now." "Where are you going?" Kaylyn quickly intervened. "I'll be staying at a hotel for a few days, so I'll be close to you," he provided. "A hotel, Patrick? You can stay here if you'd like," Matthew quickly cut in sincerely, wanting to ease his guilt whilst making everyone else happy. He saw the look on Kaylyn's face, noting the shock in his offer. Matthew could also tell from her eyes that she was secretly thanking him. "Yes, Dad. That would be great," Kaylyn said. Patrick laughed. "I really appreciate your offer, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." "Why?" Kaylyn asked, shocked by his reply. Patrick glanced at the two of them, not wanting to tell them that he thought they needed the privacy and time to develop their own relationships, so instead, he said, "I might convince Lilith to come down." "I'm sure you wouldn't want her here." He cocked a brow, and chuckled at their silence. "I'll call and visit you, sweetheart, and remember to not worry your pretty little head." "I will be fine." He kissed the top of Kaylyn's head and pulled her to him for another hug. He closed his eyes as he held her, careful not to break the tears free. "I love you," he whispered against her ear, and Kaylyn bit her lips, sucking in her emotions. "I love you too, Dad." She spoke the words which had almost become faded on her lips and in her memory. It felt so strange, yet speaking the words made her feel a lot better. She smiled and they walked to the door to see him out. After Patrick left, Kaylyn quickly ventured to the kitchen to get herself a glass of water. She poured and drank until the glass was empty, then she sighed heavily, gripping the counter for support. "Are you okay?" Matthew suddenly asked, when he saw how disheveled she had become. Kaylyn nodded. She squeaked out. Matthew moved to her. "Kaylyn, I'm sorry," he consoled. She smiled stiffly. "It's okay, Matthew. I need to stop worrying about everything. I need to think about my baby now," she exclaimed frustratingly, using her hands to express herself, as they flew about in the air. "I'm dealing with too much, Matthew. I can't take it anymore. I want to see my dad, I want to give him the time he wants with me, but my eyes sting every time I think about his condition. She trailed off, sucking in a deep breath. I don't know myself anymore, she told him now in a more calm tone, glaring at him as the tears streamed down her face. Matthew reached for her, understanding completely what she must have been going through. It was all too much for one person to handle. She sobbed in Matthew's arms and he held her, while he gently massaged her back. Matthew, she whispered between sobs, and Matthew stiffened at the frailness in her voice. I don't think this baby and I will be fine, she confessed, and Matthew squeezed his eyes shut before he slightly withdrew from her. Kaylyn, don't think like that, he exclaimed softly, using his hands to brush away her tears. You will be fine and our baby will be fine, he smiled. I don't think I'm strong enough. She broke off sobbing before she got the chance to complete her sentence. I have too much on my plate. I'm weak and this baby will suffer because of it, she cried. Matthew was left speechless for a moment, the emotions resting on his throat too heavy for him to formulate words. What if all goes wrong and the baby doesn't make it? What if I don't make it? What if my dad dies before knowing his grandchild? She began to sob uncontrollably as she thought of the worst-case scenarios. She limped in Matthew's arms, flooding his chest with tears. Matthew brought her up so her line of vision was leveled with his. He held her cheeks with his palms, wanting her to look into his glistening green eyes. Kaylyn, listen to me. Nothing will happen to you and this baby. I will be here with you along the way. Saf will be there. You are a strong woman, understood? Matthew slightly patted her cheeks, all the while never losing his eye contact. Don't you dare give up on yourself or the baby, Kaylyn. Don't you dare, he warned softly, using his thumb to brush away her tears. Kaylyn sniffed and slightly nodded. Matthew smiled as his gaze locked with Kaylyn's, making the situation a bit awkward. He got a chance to drink in her features and realized that she was as vulnerable as they came. As their gazes held, locked, caught in some strange new world in which only the two of them existed, Matthew slowly lowered his head to hers and kissed her. It was a kiss to salve every hurt Kaylyn had ever dealt with, a kiss to chase the tension and fear from her veins. Gentle, coaxing and tender, and although a passionate spark of want fizzed through his body, Matthew eased away, taking his mouth from hers. Kaylyn reached up and guided him back down, and Matthew kissed her, harder this time, his mouth hot against hers, his tongue stroking, delving, and teasing. Kaylyn found much comfort in the act, and although she knew that she would maybe regret it later, she nevertheless allowed it. Matthew kissed her until her head was dizzy and her skin tingled with the need for his touch. Her heart was galloping, her blood rushing as it ever did when he was too close. Breathing in the masculine scent of him, she felt heady with it, faint with the need for him. She wanted him, and she wanted the kiss to never cease. Hey man, the door was opened so I thought I'd let. Matthew and Kaylyn quickly broke apart when a familiar voice interrupted. Kaylyn blanched when she saw Jason at the kitchen door with his eyes and mouth wide with shock. Chapter 34. Jason stood wide-eyed, failing to believe that what he saw was actually what happened. Perhaps his eyes were playing tricks on him, he thought in dismay as he stared at Kaylyn and Matthew, who was recovering from the shock of getting caught. Jason's thoughts were in a clutter as a load of unanswered questions floated around in his head. He had thought there was nothing going on between the two, and so he had used that fact to get closer to Kaylyn, but now it seemed, Jason thought, that he was greatly mistaken. His eyes slowly shifted to Kaylyn and he watched her hung head and cheeks aflame with a blush. Grinding his teeth, when he spotted the faint smile on Matthew's face, Jason cleared his throat. I'm so sorry for interrupting, he ground out tightly with not an ounce of genuineness to his words. Matthew cleared his throat. I thought you said you weren't going to come until dinner, Matthew exclaimed with a slight frown. Yet. Business took up less time than I had thought, so I thought, why not surprise you guys? He stiffly smiled, thinking that he was the surprised one in the situation. Oh. I haven't started dinner as yet, but since you're here, you can give me a hand, Matthew suggested. Oh cool, he said, casting his gaze once again to Kaylyn. How are you, Kaylyn? He asked amidst the awkwardness. Her head finally lifted to look at him, the blush never leaving her cheeks. I'm fine, Mr. Felix, thanks for asking, she said, managing a tight-lipped smile. Jason nodded, taking a moment to run his gaze over her form. Her eyes seemed a bit puffy and her face flushed, but that didn't take away from her beauty. He was unable to see her physical feminine attributes, because the clothes she was wearing simply did not give her figure any justice. He nevertheless admired her modesty as well as her beauty. Matthew, seeing the way his friend was staring at Kaylyn as if she was the only one in the room, knitted his brows in curiosity and cleared his throat. He watched as Jason's head swiftly spun around to him, and Matthew knew that he was frightened. Kaylyn, why don't you take some rest? I'll discuss everything with Jason, he told her pointedly, not taking favor in her downcast eyes. It was evident to Matthew that the woman was still embarrassed or rather regretful of the happenings of moments ago. Kaylyn nodded, not meeting his gaze. She knew she was acting like a teenaged virgin, but how could she bring herself to look in his eyes after what happened, she thought. Her ex-boss had caught her kissing his friend. She thought hysterically. Kaylyn bit her lips, immediately remembering the taste and feel of Matthew's lips against hers. She groaned inwardly, wanting to free herself of the embarrassing memory. She turned to leave, but almost bumped into Matthew, not realizing that he had been in her way. He stepped to one side to let her pass and she stepped in the same direction, causing Matthew to still block her. Looking up at him, she managed a stiff smile whilst attempting to step past him again, but once more they both stepped in the same direction, and this time Kaylyn bumped into his chest. Matthew quickly steadied her even though she was not at risk of a fall. The breath hitched in Kaylyn's throat when he touched her, reminding her of how he had touched her moments ago. She quickly shrugged out of his embrace and slid around him, breaking the contact as she now strolled freely from the room, still a bit shaky. Matthew watched as she left, biting his lips as he watched her disappear around the corner. Jason was wearing a frown on his face as he watched the pathetic display that took place before him. He felt disgusted and immensely jealous at the fact that Matthew could just go around and get his way with any woman that he wanted. He had told him that nothing was going on between them, but watching this now, Jason knew it was the biggest lie his friend had ever told. He had planned on making Kaylyn his woman, but seeing that Matthew was now in the picture, he knew he had to work a bit harder. As soon as Matthew turned back to Jason, his frown quickly took a turn. So what's been going on, man? Jason asked, not particularly referring to Matthew's well-being, but the relationship between him and Kaylyn. Matthew, however, thought he made reference to the former and not the latter. I'm holding up, he answered. What's going on between you and Kay? The door burst open, causing Jason to stop talking in mid-sentence. Sapphire bolted through with a grin on her face. Daddy, she squealed, ignoring Jason and running into Matthew's arms. Matthew grabbed her into his arms and hoisted her up in the air, after which, planting her on his side. Hey pumpkin, how was your play date? He asked, kissing her on the cheeks. It was awesome, but I wanted to come home, she grinned. Where's Kaylyn? She asked eagerly. She must be sleeping upstairs, Matthew provided, not wanting Sapphire to disturb her, but she was already slithering through his arms. Saph honey. You can help me make dinner, he suggested with a grin. Sapphire paused and shook her head. I'd rather see Kaylyn, she said, halfway on her way out of the kitchen. Oh hi Uncle Jason, she called upon noticing Jason's presence. Matthew chuckled and shook his head. That girl is something else. Yeah, it seems she has grown quite attached to Kaylyn, Jason noticed. She has. She doesn't even want to go to school or go on play dates with her friends anymore, Matthew informed, reaching down to the lower cupboards to get the pots. Jason rose a brow. And you don't want to go to work, he stated flatly. Matthew snorted. What makes you say that, he questioned. Come on man. You have always been a workaholic. You've never had time for anything else but work. A man like you don't take the weekends off. You work, but now every time I call your office, your pa says you didn't come in. Just remember that you are one of the most successful businessmen in this state. FCK that up, and you might lose everything. Jason exclaimed, knowing that what he was saying was true, and that's all he wanted Matthew to understand. Soon, he would see that business was business and family came second, Jason thought approvingly. Matthew sighed. Look man, I know what I'm doing. I don't need a lecture from you about my professionalism. At one point business did come first but not anymore, he stated, the words sounding foreign to his own ears. Jason applauded mockingly. Well well well, look who decided to be a family guy, he laughed, but it lacked mirth. Tell me something. Matthew. Jason added firmly. Matthew sighed. What? Jason waited a moment before he asked the question he feared the answer to. Are you falling for Kaylyn Fisher? Matthew froze, the question taking him by surprise, and as he moved his lips to utter words of denial, he found that his lips could not be the source for such a lie. Chapter 35. Matthew was shocked to find himself speechless to a question he knew he should have answered moments ago. He thought of it being a possibility and impossibility, but then he found himself thinking of the possibilities a lot more. Jason stood watching the reaction on his friend's face, and knew by Matthew's silence that the answer he was looking for was loud and clear. He took a deep breath, deciding that he no longer wanted to hear his words. Matthew began before he was cut off. You know what man, don't even answer that, he quickly said before the words came from Matthew's mouth. Matthew frowned at the sudden change, but he then cleared his throat, thinking that silence was better off. After all, he wasn't quite sure what he would say. So what's for dinner? Jason asked, deciding on a change in topic. Matthew sighed. Jace, I wanted you here for a particular reason today. What's that? Jason asked curiously, moving towards the counter. I've got to tell you the reason Kaylyn can no longer work for you, he exclaimed, watching Jason's brow rise questioningly. Patrick sat on the sofa tapping his phone against his chin as he contemplated on whether or not he should give his wife a call. Amidst everything that happened, he still considered his wife family, and although the walls of their love were thinning, it wasn't completely gone. He got up and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the bedside table. Emptying the contents, he smiled, thinking of how much better he felt now that he had made amends with his daughter. He still had a lot to make up for, but he thought that he was close to home. He wanted peace, he wanted forgiveness, and he wanted love, and even though Lilith seemed like a lost cause in the situation, he was willing to give it a try. He wanted his family again, even with the little time he had left. Folding his lips, Patrick quickly dialed his wife's number. He was anxious, he felt nervous because he knew that what he was about to ask was big. What do you want? She answered at the first ring, sounding the way she always sounded, miserable. Patrick sighed, taking a seat on the bed. Lilith, we need to talk. She snorted. You left to visit her even though I specifically told you that you shouldn't, she exclaimed, then choked out a laugh. You know, Patrick, it is too late to be feeling like a rebel at your age. Lilith, I did not call to have an argument, for Christ's sake, Patrick sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. Then what did you call here for, dear old husband, she hissed bitterly. I want to talk to you, Patrick announced. And what are we doing now, playing catch? I mean in person. Please, could you take a flight down so we could sort things out, he asked, then cleared his throat. She laughed. I hope you're hearing how ridiculous you are sounding right now, she quipped. Patrick swallowed, briefly closing his eyes. It's important, Lilith, so is the business I have running here. Why don't you come home and we'll talk then, she suggested crisply. I'm finally trying to make things right with my daughter. Where is your heart, Lilith? It was almost a whisper, close to a plea. She snorted. Do you even know what you're doing, Patrick? You are ruining our marriage. Our family. She spat. You ruined our family years ago. He fired back harshly. There was a small silence. Patrick bit his lips and raked a hand through his hair. Lilith. I'm sick. I haven't much time left here. I just want my family back. I want the little. Just stop it. Her irritated voice came. You're willing to stoop that low, bringing sickness into this so I can feel. What? She spat. Sympathy. Lying never suited well on you, Patrick, so cut the crap. I will not come down there so you can fill my head with sob stories and pleas of unity, she exclaimed. Lilith, I'm telling you the truth, he began. Goodbye, Patrick. I'll be here when you finally grow some balls and realize what a horrible thing you have done by going against me, she blared. Lily, he stopped, realizing that she disconnected the call. Patrick sighed, gritting his teeth to anchor the wave of emotions that was about to sink him. He placed both elbows on his knees, while using his palms to cup his face. Sniffing, he used his hand to wipe the tears from his face. Oh my God, man, I'm so sorry, Jason exclaimed, clasping his hand over his mouth to hide his shock. Yeah, Matthew said, chopping the vegetables. He had finally developed the courage to inform his friend about his current situations, and Matthew had to admit, it felt good to finally have the load off his chest. How's Kaylyn holding up? Jason asked with his mouth still agape with shock. She's doing pretty good considering what she has gone through, man. She's a strong woman, he exclaimed while managing a faint smile. Jason nodded, carefully scrutinizing his friend. He then bit his lips, pondering on what he was just told. He had never thought things were so complicated with them, but now complicated was proving to be a big understatement. Jason raked his hand across his face when he thought of how he would further complicate matters by wanting to pursue Kaylyn. It was clear to him that they had their own troubles to mop out, as it was. I'm sorry, man, he sighed. Yeah, it's cool. No, that's not what I mean. I'm sorry that I liked your lady, he confessed, knowing that it was probably a stupid thing to do, but he felt like it was the right thing as well. What? Matthew asked, confused. Jason scratched his head. I didn't think you would be the type to settle down. I thought Kaylyn was just a complication for you, so I wanted her for myself, so to speak. He swallowed hard, watching the hardened expression on his friend's face. Wanted her for yourself? Matthew spat. Do you know how effing sick that sounds? You're my best friend, for Christ's sake. He snarled. Jason huffed out a breath. I liked her. I didn't think you did. I'm sorry. Matthew snorted in disbelief. What happened to fraternization in the workplace? Why are you even telling me this? He asked now, brows shot up questioningly. Jason cleared his throat. I just wanted to ease my conscience, especially after what you just told me. Matthew glared at him for a moment, thinking of how fucked up everything was. Instead of feeling a strong sense of dislike for his friend, Matthew sighed. Just go set the damn table, will you? Matthew exclaimed, shaking his head. So you're not mad? Jason asked, flabbergasted by his reaction. Of course I am, but I already have a shitload of things going on for me. I'll just pretend like you didn't say what you did, just don't look at or talk to Kaylyn for too long and we'll be fine, he warned. Jason's brows shot up. Really? Wow, love must have really changed you. For the better, he grinned, watching the clueless expression on Matthew's face. Jason's grin loosened into a smile as he walked towards Matthew and patted him on the shoulder. You'll understand in due time. Dinner was served an hour later with Kaylyn seated beside Sapphire and Jason and Matthew at the opposite end. There was silence, Matthew and Kaylyn still awkward after the kiss, and Jason awkward after Matthew's threat. Sapphire, however, was oblivious of what was going on, and so she ate, not mindful of the tension that floated in the room. So Kaylyn, have you been thinking of any names for the baby? Jason asked, after clearing his throat. Kaylyn paused, sparing a glance at Matthew before she spoke. Not Rea. How about Elsa? She's my favorite princess, Sapphire cut in with a twinkle in her eyes. What if it's a boy? Matthew asked with a smile. Sapphire tapped her chin with the fork, in deep thought. Jack. She beamed and everyone laughed. Matthew was about to speak when the doorbell rang. Excusing himself from the table, he got up and moved towards the door, wondering who it could be. He sighed before opening the door, irritated by the interruption. His eyes widened when two elderly persons presented themselves, a smile etched on both their faces. Chapter 36. Matthew just stood open-mouthed, as he stared upon the standing figures which were before him. Well, are you just going to make us stand here until our legs give? The woman exclaimed mockingly, earning a smile from Matthew. Hey Mom! Dad! Matthew greeted, moving towards his mother to pull her in for a hug. It has been so long, his mother Rachel exclaimed, closing her eyes to revel in the comfort of the embrace. Too long, Matthew said, pulling apart. He moved towards his father and patted him on the back as they engaged in a brief hug. Dad, it's nice to see you. Likewise son, John Mayhew announced. So what brought you guys here? Matthew asked, moving to the side to allow them entry. Well, we are finally back from our vacation, so we thought we'd surprise ye, Rachel exclaimed, moving into the house as her eyes roamed the interior. Well, I'm definitely surprised. How was Jamaica? Matthew asked, closing the door behind him. Like heaven! John exclaimed brightly. Rachel nodded in agreement as she slyly moved towards her husband, placing a hand on his chest, while their gazes locked lovingly. And your father was like God, she teased, smiling up at John, who smiled pleasingly before placing a kiss on his wife's mouth. Matthew rolled his eyes. You do realize your age is right? He asked, cocking a questionable brow. Rachel laughed and fanned him off while continuing her quest into the house. Where's my grandbaby? She asked loud enough so that if Sapphire was in the house, she was able to hear, wherever she was. Grandma! Grandpa! Sapphire squealed, meeting them at the entrance to the kitchen. Rachel caught her just in time as Sapphire pranced into her arms. Ah, my little snookums, you are growing prettier by the day. Rachel exclaimed, kissing Sapphire on the cheek. She grinned as her face went red from the compliment. You're pretty too, Grandma, for an old woman," she grinned, while everyone else laughed. "Well, you always know how to flatter your dear old grandma, don't you?" Rachel chuckled, pinching her cheeks. "Hey Grandpa!" Sapphire beamed at John, who effortlessly took her into his arms. "Hello to my favorite grandchild in the world," John smiled, talking secretly to Sapphire while Rachel's eyes landed on Jason. "Jason darling. Well, aren't you just ravishing?" she teased, moving towards Jason, who hugged her while they laughed joyously. Jason chuckled. "Nice to see you, Mrs. Mayhew." "Mr. Mayhew," he greeted with a smile. Kaylyn stood smiling as she watched the interactions between family members. She was growing more nervous by the second because she knew her time would come when she would have to explain who she was, which she was unprepared for. After numerous guesses as to who might have been at the door, Matthew's parents were not one of them, and now her nerves were on a roller coaster ride. Just as Kaylyn put her thoughts to a halt, she swallowed hard when Rachel and John's eyes landed on her. "Well, aren't you a ray of sunshine?" Rachel beamed, moving towards Kaylyn. She smiled. "Hello." Kaylyn's gaze momentarily wavered from the woman to Sapphire, who was wriggling her way out of her grandfather's hands. She quickly skipped to Kaylyn, holding her by the hand. "Grandma, this is Kaylyn," she provided proudly with a witty smile. "Nice to meet you, dear," she smiled. "But I'm sure you had blonde hair from the last time I saw you," she exclaimed, knitting her brows in curiosity. "No," Kaylyn began but was thankfully interrupted by Matthew. "Mom, that was Catherine," Matthew corrected distastefully, not liking the taste of the woman's name in his mouth. "Oh yes, I remember her, little rich girl," she scowled and then turned to Matthew. "Matthew honey, I think I remember you telling us that you were engaged to her," Rachel exclaimed. Matthew frowned. "Yeah, we broke things off. Catherine is a bitch." Sapphire cut in bitterly. "Sapphire!" Matthew scolded. Rachel's eyes widened as she stooped to Sapphire before she started grinning. "I always knew you were a smart girl. That woman was as fake as my Gucci purses," she said, then laughed. Kaylyn giggled, causing Rachel to look up at her, with curiosity in her eyes. Matthew, on the other hand, watched as his mother gave Kaylyn another hearty once-over, and he instantly knew that Kaylyn would soon be prey to his mother's inquisitions. Stepping forward, he announced. "Do you guys care to join us for dinner? There's space at the table," he quickly said. "Well, not before someone tells me who this beautiful stranger is," Rachel exclaimed. "I'm a friend," Kaylyn provided. "Oh, I see. You're Matt's new girlfriend," she winked. Kaylyn paled, her mouth opened in shock. Guys, I'm sorry, but I'll have to leave now. Something has come up that needs my attention," Jason announced, demanding the attention of everyone else. "Okay dear. I'd love to catch up, but since it's urgent, that'll have to stay for some other time," Rachel said, moving to embrace Jason with a hug. He then shook John's hand, said his goodbyes to the others, then left, leaving the others to revel in the awkward silence that was left behind. "Well, let's eat," Matthew said, moving towards the cupboards to get some more plates. Kaylyn released a sigh of relief when Rachel seemed to have given up the questioning. She moved towards the table, pulling out a chair for herself before she sat. Everyone now sat at the table eating, without saying a word. Utensils clunk and vegetables crunched, but words were swallowed and not uttered. "You know, Sapphire honey, I have a brand new doll just for you. You can play with it and take care of it when you're home bored," John announced, breaking the silence. Sapphire smiled. "Thanks Grandpa, but I won't have time." I'm getting a baby sister or brother soon, so I will be real busy, she exclaimed proudly, causing Matthew to choke on his juice, Kaylyn to go moonlight pale and the Mayhews to look clueless. Coughing and clearing his throat, Matthew stood. Desert anyone, he asked, thinking of the worst possible timing for Sapphire to break the news. He planned on informing his parents about the changes in his life, but he needed time to really think about how he would break the news. Oh shush! Rachel said, fanning at Matthew dismissively as she turned her full attention to Sapphire. Honey, what do you mean? She asked. Kaylyn's pregnant, she offered brightly. Rachel's eyes widened as she glanced at Kaylyn, then at Matthew, whose head was hung as he rubbed his temple. Matthew, is that true? John spoke for Rachel, who was still in shock. Sighing, Matthew moved towards Kaylyn. Yes, this is Kaylyn Fisher. She has been staying with us for a few weeks now and she's pregnant with my child, Matthew announced, placing a hand around the small of Kaylyn's back. She smiled stiffly, wanting to sink through the floor. Rachel's eyes widened further. Oh my lord! She exclaimed, then turned to John. I knew that vacation was a bad idea. We have missed out on so much. She moved from around the table and hugged Kaylyn, which took her by surprise, and then she hugged Matthew. Congratulations, darling. I always wanted a house full of grandbabies. She smiled brightly, stepping aside to allow her husband to congratulate them. She stood smiling proudly, even though she knew she had a whole lot of questions to ask. The first question being, so when is the wedding? She beamed with a grin. Chapter 37. Knowing his parents, Matthew knew that he should expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for the question in which his mother posed. It left him defenseless and too awkward to formulate a reply. We Matthew trailed off, unsure of what else to say. Rachel and John suddenly began to laugh so hard they had to hold on to each other for support. John, honey, did you see Matt's face? She managed breathlessly, her voice trembling with laughter. And poor Kaylyn looked like she has seen a ghost, Rachel laughed, using her fingers to wipe the joyous tears that formed in her eyes. They continued to laugh while Kaylyn and Matthew stared at them in disbelief. We got you this time, hey. Anyway, I was just kidding. It's your lives, you should know how to make your own decisions, Rachel smiled, pinching Matt's cheeks. Come, let's talk. Sapphire, honey, why don't you go play with your toys while the grown-ups talk? Rachel suggested as she stooped to talk to her granddaughter. Sapphire pouted. I don't have to. My baby brain won't understand a thing you're saying, she stated. Rachel laughed. I have a feeling that this baby brain will understand everything. She pinched her cheeks and placed a kiss on her forehead. Run along now. Sapphire glanced at Kaylyn for approval. I'll be fine, honey. I'll be up in a while, she reassured, and Sapphire nodded before she stomped off. The little display did not go unnoticed by Rachel. She smiled without saying a word and then moved to the living room, where they sat. So how far along is my grandbaby? Rachel asked as soon as she was settled comfortably in the sofa. 16 weeks, Kaylyn provided. Wow, and your bump is hardly showing, she acknowledged, dropping her gaze to Kaylyn's stomach. Kaylyn smiled. You know, I've always told Matthew that he needed to get back out there after Marcia died, but he became a playboy instead. I thought he was finally settling down when I heard of his engagement to that Catherine girl, but she was just about as cuddly as a cactus, Rachel remarked. Mom. Who's Marcia? Kaylyn couldn't resist asking. Rachel sighed sadly before answering. She's Sapphire's mother. Died right after giving birth to Sapphire, God bless her soul, she explained in a saddened tone, oblivious of the fact that she was rehashing the events of the past. Kaylyn gasped, swinging her head to look at Matthew, with newly formed tears in her eyes. Matthew used the tip of his tongue to moisten his lips, as he used a finger to massage his temple. "Kaylyn, sweetheart, is something wrong?" Rachel asked in concern, seeing the tears that spilled from her eyes. She shook her head to clear her thoughts as she stood. "Excuse me," she said shakily before dashing from the room. Rachel and John glared at Matthew in confusion and concern. "Did I say anything wrong?" she asked. Matthew shook his head and sighed. "Kaylyn has a condition called placenta previa. Both her and the baby may be at risk during birth," he informed before getting up to find Kaylyn, taking a glimpse at his mother, who used her hand to cover her mouth in order to hide her shock. Matthew found her in the garden, sitting on a bench. She didn't notice his presence, because her back was turned, but he was able to see how she hugged her shoulders and rocked her body to the imaginary tune of sorrow. He inhaled deeply and moved towards her, sitting on the space beside her. He looked ahead at the flourishing plants as he thought of what he would say to her. A minute passed before he finally developed the courage to talk. "I met Marcia at a charity auction. She was so beautiful that I was immediately captivated by her laugh and gentle spirit. A few months in the relationship she fell pregnant. We were so happy when we found out it was a baby girl." Matthew managed a laugh and paused as he hung his head to prepare himself for what he would say next. "But she developed high blood pressure, which resulted in seizures during childbirth. The doctors were able to save Sapphire, but Marcia..." He trailed off and shook his head, while trying to develop some courage. "She didn't even get the chance to see the beauty she had created." Matthew's throat burned as he spoke, an indication of the grief that was slowly consuming his body. "She died," he finally uttered through a hoarse voice. Looking up at Kaylyn, he saw the sadness in her smoky grey eyes, and the tears that stained her face, but Matthew knew that he had to get everything out in the open. "And on that day a part of me died with her," he choked out brokenly, placing his face in his palms to create a barrier for the tears that threatened to spill. He considered himself to be a strong man, and so he sucked in the tears, but what was the use of strength when the heart was weak? Kaylyn folded her lips, understanding his grief, and without thinking twice, she reached for him, enveloping him in her arms as his body shook with the tremors of tears. Matthew had always given her a shoulder to cry on, but this time, a little change was well needed. All the buried emotions came tumbling because despite being the tough guy he was, this was the first since Marcia died that he ever spoke to anyone about it, and the memories were a bit tough to relieve. The weight of his sorrows had built a grave for him, leaving him to bury himself in the only thing he thought would quell his grief, and that was his work. But now, without even realizing, Kaylyn was slowly crumbling the walls he had built after Marcia's death. Matthew brought himself up to look at Kaylyn with his blue eyes glossy with his tears and face flushed. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier," he stated shakily, as he quickly wiped his face. "I just couldn't bring myself to do so. I didn't want to upset you further." He spoke in a tone that spoke of sincerity, wanting to make Kaylyn believe that what he was saying was true, but the words had deemed useless because forgiveness was already given. Kaylyn reached for his hand and gently squeezed it. "It's okay. I understand, and I'm sorry for your loss," she smiled reassuringly. The silence that followed gave them both some time to compose themselves, and when that was achieved, Matthew smiled. "We'll be fine. We'll get through this together," he said, nodding convincingly. Kaylyn, believing the words were true, leaned in on Matthew's chest. He wrapped an arm around her, and held her to him as they sat silently, neither of them cognizant of the fact that Rachel and John were lurking around a corner, watching every second of their emotional moment. Rachel smiled up at her husband pleasingly. "They will be just fine," she acknowledged warmly, as she watched with love. John placed a hand around his wife's shoulders and pulled her closer to him as he too watched contentedly. "Yes, they will be," he smiled, placing a kiss on the top of Rachel's head. Chapter 38. A few weeks later, Matthew received a call to an urgent meeting in his office. Sapphire was away at school and Kaylyn was having lunch with her dad, so it gave Matthew a little time to attend to his business. As soon as the elevator door opened to his floor, his pa met him at the door. Matthew ground his teeth. "Who is in my office and why couldn't you tell me who it was over the phone?" he fumed as he strode past the woman. She walked briskly to catch up to him. They asked me not to say anything. They said you wouldn't want to see them if you knew beforehand," she defended shakily. Matthew stopped in his tracks suddenly, causing the girl to bump into his back. "And who the hell do you work for, Elaine, me or whoever the fuck is in there?" he asked angrily. Elaine withered back, her face flaming red with embarrassment. "Sorry sir," she croaked out fearfully. Matthew sighed heavily and raked a hand through his hair. "It's fine," he said, managing a stiff smile that made Elaine's eyes go wide. He strode in the direction of his office, exuding dominance with every stride. He paused at his door, taking in a deep breath before he entered. He had thought about a lot of persons who could have been in his office, but the two faces that presented themselves were not in his top 10. The bells stood in the center of the room, turning suddenly when they heard the door open. Matthew didn't exactly know if he should be feeling anger towards the two, or shock. He knew he shouldn't be feeling hatred towards them, but they created an offspring he hated. Clearing his throat, and moving behind his desk, he took a seat and gestured for them to do the same. "What brings you here?" he asked firmly, watching the rigid expression on Constantine's face. Elizabeth Bell looked disheveled in Matthew's eyes. Her eyes looked red and puffy and she was fidgeting with a handkerchief in her lap. Something was definitely up. "Matthew, we know what our daughter did and we are extremely sorry. We are very sorry for the distress she put you and your family through," Constantine began. "We know that your engagement was just one to strengthen business relationships, you didn't love each other," he acknowledged faintly. Matthew moistened his lips with the tip of his tongue. "Where is this conversation going?" he asked, not liking the topic of Catherine and his past mistakes. "We need your help," Elizabeth sniffed, her lips trembling. Matthew scoffed and eased back in his chair, finding amusement in the words that came from the woman's lips. "With?" Matthew asked, cocking a curious brow. "Our daughter." "Catherine," she muttered timidly. Matthew wanted to laugh, but he refrained himself from doing so. "Please Matthew, I know that it may sound ridiculous considering what she has done to you, but we wouldn't be asking if we didn't really need your help," Constantine inserted pleadingly. Matthew knew in himself that he wouldn't dare think of helping the woman. Heck, he was only preparing himself for ruining her for what she did to Kaylyn. "What's the problem?" he asked. The couple looked at each other, before Elizabeth hung her head. Constantine cleared his throat. "Catherine has become a drug addict," he croaked out. Matthew's eyes widened. "What?" "It has been going on for a while now, and we told her to get herself help, but Matthew, she is a different person." "You mean, no longer a bitch?" Matthew injected tersely. "Catherine did her fair share of unkind things in the past and for that we are sorry, but our baby girl is losing herself." Mayhew, Constantine folded his lips momentarily as if to regain his composure. "Her personal bank account is empty and every single penny we give her, she uses it to buy cocaine or some sort of drug that's only destroying her." Matthew had to admit, he had found their declaration surprising, and the conflicting feelings that experiencing, left him confused. "We don't know what caused this, but we want her back." Constantine ground it out through tightly clenched teeth as his eyes watered. "We want you to go talk to her. Please," Elizabeth exclaimed shakily. Matthew scoffed at that. "Me?" he asked a bit mockingly. "If you truly understood the hell that woman put my family through, you wouldn't be asking this of me. You know I was planning on making her pay for all things she's done, but I guess karma is a greater bitch than her," he exclaimed pointedly. Elizabeth bolted from her chair and gripped Matthew's hands which were on his table. "Please, I beg of you. Just once. Please, Matthew," she begged, a tear falling from her wrinkle-edged eyes. Matthew wanted to pull away his hand and decline once more, but the sorrow in the woman's eyes could not go unnoticed. Matthew pondered on their words as his thoughts momentarily drifted back to what Catherine had done and said a month ago. She deserved the hell she was now going through. Every bit of it, Matthew thought, but as his brain created the thought, his heart disagreed. He gritted his teeth. "Fine, I will visit her, but only to gloat," he informed firmly. Matthew stood pacing the floor of Catherine's apartment for what seemed like hours as he contemplated on his decision. He thought of walking away many times, but he somehow found himself stuck in at her place. Muttering a low curse, he finally walked to her door, raising his fist to knock, but only to pause when he realized the door was slightly ajar. Matthew entered without a protesting thought in mind, a gasp escaping his lips when he saw the state of her apartment. Take-out boxes and what looked like dirty laundry judging from the smell littered the room unimpressively. The furniture was unorganized and the floor was reeking dirt. "Catherine!" Matthew called, moving into the room, and almost stumbling over an empty beer bottle on the floor. "Catherine!" he called again, after muttering a low curse. Catherine stumbled through another room in a suffocating tight black dress, with hair looking frizzy and uncombed. Matthew stared in disbelief. "What the hell has happened to you?" he asked. Catherine, finally recovered from the shock of seeing Matthew, grinned widely as she moved towards him. "Matt, you came," she smiled sheepishly as she walked drunkenly towards him. Seeing her up close, Matthew realized her running mascara, the deep dark bags under her eyes and her red nose. "What is going on, Catherine?" he asked. She giggled and sniffed. Nothing's wrong with me. I'm fine. I bet my parents told you about this. If I knew you were coming, I would have dressed up for ye," she said, running her hands around the nape of her neck, before bringing her fingers to her mouth, where she bit her nails. "Yo, you look good," she acknowledged with a trembling smile, her eyes wildly searching the room. "What have you done to yourself?" Matthew demanded in disgust. Catherine raised an index finger. "I changed," she sniffed, swiping her hand across her nose. She moved to the sofa and sat, clasping her knees with her hands as she rocked her body to an imaginary tune. "I did a lot of bad things. I ruined people's life just because I could," she confessed shakily, resting her face on her knees. "I'm sorry, you know. For what I did to you," she glanced at Matthew wearily before continuing. "I was angry with you and I was angry with the girl I tried to make you love me for 2 years and then she came along and you fell for her so quickly." Trailing off, she raked her fingers through her hair. She sniffed and pulled the hanging dress strap over her shoulder. "I feel good now. I'm not hurting anyone now. Do you have any money on you?" "My parents won't give me any no more." She scratched her neck, then her arm, before biting her lips. Matthew stood in utter shock as he watched and listened to the woman. He had been expecting a cokehead, but this was worst. She was far from the Catherine he knew. "Catherine, you need help," Matthew stated. Catherine sniffed hard, shaking her leg as she folded her arms at the chest. "I'm fine. I feel good. I'm much happier than I've ever been in years." She trailed off and hugged her shoulders. "I'm happy, Matthew, I'm happy," she smiled shakily, wanting to convince him of the lie. When she was tearing apart, sorrow was the knife. Matthew shook his head, no longer feeling anger towards the woman, but pity. She was a wreck and she needed help. Matthew watched as her eyes searched the room as she nibbled on a fingernail. Her head snapped towards him. "Do you have any on you?" she asked, twirling her mouth from side to side. "I'm out, so do you." Matthew shook his head. "You are going to kill yourself, if you continue to do this, Catherine. You need professional help," Matthew exclaimed, watching as Catherine shook her head in denial. "Don't tell me what to do!" she screamed, as she stepped backwards, away from Matthew with tears streaming down her face. Her back now against the wall, she slid to the floor with her knees to her chest. "People always tell me what to do. No more. Catherine is a big girl now, Catherine can take care of herself, Catherine is happy," she said the last words over and over, sniffing and rocking her body on the floor. Matthew watched, speechless and unsure of what to do. Catherine looked up. "I love you, Matt, I love you," she giggled, attempting to stand. "So do you have any on you?" she asked, moving towards him. "No, Catherine, I don't," he exclaimed. "You're lying, why are you lying to me, Matt?" she cried, then began to pace the room. "I can show you a good time, just give me a small amount," she said, quickly grabbing Matthew's belt. He slapped away her hands, and grabbed her by the shoulders, noticing how light and frail she felt in his hands. Matthew shook her. "You need to get yourself together and find some help, Catherine," he advised between tightly clenched teeth. She looked at him, as the tears began to flow down her flushed face. She limped her head against her own shoulder, still staring at Matthew, while she cried. "Help me," she whispered, barely audible, but it was an echo of desperation and sadness. Chapter 39. Revenge sometimes blurred the sense of reasoning. Matthew told himself that Catherine had met her downfall without having to face his wrath, but upon further contemplation he realized that nothing he could have done would ever meet the cruelty of her addiction. So Matthew bit his lips, trying to fight back the part in his brain that told him that she deserved every moment of her self-torture. Maybe she did deserve it, but who is he to judge? Wiping his hand across his mouth, Matthew pointed towards her room. "Go pack yourself a bag with clothes," he ground out between tightly clenched teeth. Catherine looked at him, confused. What?" she choked out brokenly. "You are going to pack yourself a bag and then I'm going to drive you to a rehabilitation center. You're gonna sign yourself in and get your effing self cleaned." The words came out firmly as he was forcing himself to get them out. Catherine's eyes widened as she blindly took a step away from him. I can't," she stuttered, eyes wildly searching. Matthew inhaled a deep breath and watched her with fiercely narrowed eyes. She moved to one corner on the room, leaning against the wall as she bit her nails and shook her legs. Her eyes flashed to Matthew. You really care about me that much, Matthew?" she asked softly with a mirthful gleam in her red-rimmed eyes. "After everything I've done, I'm doing this for my own peace of mind, Catherine," he bit out abruptly. "Now go." She managed a weak and wavering smile as the shimmer of sadness smarted her eyes again. She nodded and timidly walked from the room. Matthew immediately slumped to the old garbage-filled sofa. He brought his palms to his forehead, wandering into deep thought as he contemplated on his choices. When did he become such a person wanting to help his enemy? Matthew thought in dismay. When had he changed? What changed him? The questions created a puzzle in his thoughts and he found that he wasn't equipped with the answers to solve them. Catherine emerged a few minutes later with a small suitcase lagging behind. She swallowed visibly, while using her free hand to hug her shoulder. Matthew released one last sigh and shook his head pitifully before he moved towards the door. Parking outside the huge rehabilitation center, they both stared at the building for a few moments, Catherine especially, who looked lost to the world. Turning to Matthew, she moistened her cracked lips and cleared her throat. "Thank you," she announced, barely audible. Matthew stiffly nodded and watched as she opened the door to go outside. "And Matthew?" She paused and spun around to look at him. "I'm really sorry," she sniffed as a tear made a trail down her ashen skin. She then got out, reaching for her suitcase, which was in the back. She pulled it out with much effort and flashed Matthew one last weak smile before she strolled off. Matthew watched as she entered the building before he drove off. "This one looks nice." "Do you like this one?" Kaylyn asked Sapphire excitedly. They were both lying on Kaylyn's bed, with legs in the air, while they strolled through a baby magazine. Sapphire twisted her mouth and expelled a hum, as she patted her small finger against her chin in deep thought. Kaylyn stifled the laugh that bubbled up from her chest. "Kinda looks too old," she disapproved. "How about this one?" she squealed excitedly, pointing at a white crib. Sure," she agreed hesitantly. Sapphire smiled triumphantly and rolled over on her back, with her hands behind her head staring up at Kaylyn. "So how was lunch with your dad?" she asked, and Kaylyn smiled, suddenly remembering how good it was to talk and laugh with her dad like old times. They had talked for hours while enjoying the delicacies they ordered for lunch. She tried not to remember how frielier her dad was getting by the day. She only looked on the good side, taking great comfort in his laughs that wrinkled the edges of his eyes and tilted his head back. That was the father she knew and loved. "Kaylyn, are you okay?" Sapphire asked concernedly upon realizing that Kaylyn had drifted off into her own world. Kaylyn suddenly jolted herself from her phase. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "Yes, of course honey," she smiled reassuringly. "And lunch with Dad was great, thanks for asking," she pinched Sapphire's cheeks. Sapphire grinned. "Your dad is cool, but your mom is a bye." She suddenly stopped herself from saying the last bit. "Not so nice person," she completed hastily, bursting out a laugh after. Kaylyn laughed and began to tickle her, bringing Sapphire to tears. Matthew watched from the door, a smile curving his lips as he watched the display. For the first time, he was hearing a real laugh from Kaylyn, a laugh that came from her soul. Erupted from her heart. Her orange mass of hair fell in all directions as she writhed beneath Sapphire's tickles. With her face flushed and her eyes almost closed with joy, Matthew watched admirably. His gaze drifted to Sapphire, who was above Kaylyn, trying to administer tickles to her arms, but Kaylyn was also tickling her, and so she laughed, with the few missing teeth at the front of her mouth, adding to her cuteness. For the first in a long time, Matthew was finally able to see her true happiness, and it brought joyous warmth to his heart. His stomach knotted upon realizing that this was all he needed. Two people whose happiness made him happy. A hiccup interrupted Sapphire's laughter and Matthew chuckled, but it waned when he realized he had made his presence known. He swallowed, watching the two break apart with laughter still evident on their faces. Kaylyn's tousled hair now fell to her face in the most attractive manner Matthew had ever seen. Her cheeks were red and her small mouth slightly agape with the evidence of her laughter. Matthew, no longer cognizant of the fact that he had been caught, only smiled as he stared at Kaylyn. Sapphire, seeing his father completely love-struck, cleared her throat. "Dad, are you okay?" she grinned, causing Matthew to swiftly flash his head towards her. He momentarily glanced at Kaylyn, whose face had gone redder. Matthew cleared his throat. "Yeah, I'm fine, Pumpkin. Kaylyn, may I have a word with you? He asked. Kaylyn nodded as she eased up on the bed. Sure. Sapphire, seeing that the conversation wouldn't involve her, got the gist and rolled from the bed. I'll be back, she announced, strolling from the room after flashing Matthew a smile. Matthew moved closer and pulled up a chair closer to the bed where Kaylyn sat. What's going on? She asked upon seeing the tension in his features. Matthew met her gaze. I went to visit Catherine today, he announced abruptly, pausing to see the reaction on Kaylyn's face. He saw how the cords in her neck moved and the way her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't say a word, only glanced away from him. I went to work and found the bells in my office, he continued. They were pleading with me to go see her. Matthew trailed off, mustering within himself the courage to continue with what he had to say next. Catherine has a drug addiction, he blurted, and at that immediate moment, Kaylyn's head flashed up, as her piercing grey eyes widened with shock. What? She gasped, appalled. Matthew nodded. They asked me to talk some sense into her. They said that I might have been the only person to get through to her, and Kaylyn. Matthew exclaimed as his words grew more passionate. As much as I wanted to see and laugh in her face for the trouble she has caused you. He confessed with a visible swallow. She was almost unrecognizable, she was nothing like the Catherine we both know. A mess would be too nice a word to describe her and the situation she was in. Kaylyn swallowed the painful lump that formed in her throat. She cut herself off and cleared her throat. What did you do? She asked. Fearful of the reaction he would gain from his declaration, Matthew sat silent for some passing seconds. I drove her to a rehabilitation center to get herself cleaned, he finally blurted. An awkward silence fell, Matthew dying to hear a reply from Kaylyn. A reaction, but all he got was a face void of emotions. Kaylyn, I'm sorry. I know that Catherine deserved every single bit of torture for what she did to you, and I understand that you must be feeling betrayed even. Matthew ranted on, trying to bring forth solace in his words to make them seem less harmful. Matthew, Kaylyn interjected, and finally Matthew stopped, his mouth slight agape with the words that paused on his lips. It's fine really, she reassured him, smiling when Matthew's reaction turned to one of utter shock. What? Matthew choked, as he wondered if he was hearing correctly. It's fine, I'm not mad if that's what you're worried about, her voice trembled with laughter. We aren't perfect, no one is, and while I may not have liked what she did. She trailed off and scratched her head. What I'm trying to say is, you did the right thing by helping her. My shock really came from the fact that you helped her, she smiled. Matthew, recovering from his shock, choked out a laugh. You're really cool about this? He asked in disbelief. Kaylyn nodded. I won't say I've forgiven her, but she certainly doesn't deserve to suffer, you know, she shrugged. I'm proud of you, she smiled. Matthew grinned, thinking of the unexpected turn of events. You're really amazing, you know, he grinned whilst moving towards her. With arms outstretched, he pulled her in for a hug, smiling contentedly. Sapphire startled them both, by creeping up behind and yelling, "Group hug!" They all laughed, reveling in the happiness of the loving embrace. Chapter 40. Lunch was silent, but the tension was tangible. Secret gazes were shared under eyes and giggles erupted from one particular person, Sapphire. Kaylyn, suddenly curious as to what was going on, placed her sandwich on the plate and eased back in her chair. Okay, what's going on? She demanded with mirth tainting her voice. Sapphire looked from her to Matthew and they both shrugged. Nothing. They both exclaimed in unison, but Kaylyn wasn't convinced. I've seen you both sharing secret glances. I know something is up, Kaylyn retorted. Sapphire did not say anything, she continued to play with her bread, whilst folding her lips to prevent a smile. Kaylyn glanced at Matthew and cocked a brow in curiosity, wanting to get some answers from him at least. Matthew held up his hands in mock surrender. I don't know what's going on. The look on his face was evidence to his words, but Kaylyn couldn't help but notice the twinkling mischief in his eyes. Sighing in defeat, she shoved her plate away from her. Well, anyway. Faith and I are going shopping in a while, she informed, seeing the shock on Sapphire's face. Do you want to come, Saph? Sapphire instantly looked from Kaylyn to Matthew, then to Kaylyn again. I thought you were only going to hang out with Faith, she said a bit hysterically. No, we're going baby shopping also, she smiled, and Sapphire's eyes widened. She looked to Matthew for permission. Daddy. Matthew cleared his throat. Pumpkin, you promised Grandma and Grandpa that you would visit them today, Matthew reminded, cocking his brow. Sapphire looked genuinely confused for a moment, but quickly she muttered, yes, how could I forget, she said as she managed a smile. Kaylyn tried not to show her disappointment. Oh. Well, the ringing of the doorbell cut her off in mid-sentence. That must be Faith. I'll get it, she exclaimed excitedly as she moved from around the table and towards the door. Sapphire turned to Matthew. But Daddy, I wanted to go shop with, she pouted. Matthew sighed, knowing the protest was coming. Saph, you promised me you would help me out with this. We can all go shopping some other day, Matthew whispered. Just think about how happy Kaylyn will be at the end of the day, he winked with a reassuring smile. Okay, Daddy, she grinned now after being convinced. Matthew pinched her cheek. That's my girl. Shhh, he immediately cut in when he heard footsteps nearing in on them. Faith and Kaylyn entered the room with a smile. I'll go get my purse, Kaylyn informed Faith as she quickly strode from the room. Faith was left prey to the two pair of predator eyes that watched her from around the table. Good morning, she greeted with a tight smile. Sapphire threw her a hard gaze and muttered a barely audible good morning, under her breath. Faith cleared her throat, feeling the tension and silently praying for Kaylyn to join her ASAP. So, Sapphire began firmly. Kaylyn must not stay out late because she needs her rest, and if you take her out to eat, don't get her fish because it makes her feel sick, she informed sternly, her gaze settled on Faith. Faith couldn't help laughing. Aren't you the one who's supposed to be telling me this? She directly asked Matthew. He was about to reply when Kaylyn came back into the room. I'm all set, she said almost breathlessly. Matthew rose from his chair. May I have a quick word with you before you leave? He asked Kaylyn, who nodded and followed behind Matthew, who was already leading the way. What's up? Kaylyn asked as soon as they were alone. Matthew did not answer immediately, he instead reached into his pocket for his wallet. Matt, that's not necessary. I already have what I need, she declined. Matthew shook his head disapprovingly. I want to do this, so please let me, he said as he handed the credit card in her direction. Kaylyn sighed and hesitated for a while, contemplating on whether or not she should accept it. It wasn't that she wasn't appreciative of his offer, but she felt somewhat strange to be taking favors from a man. She always considered herself a prideful woman. However, she knew that with Matthew being the father of her child, it was going to be a frequent thing, so she might as well get accustomed to it. She finally took it and managed a smile. Thank you, she reached up and kissed him briefly on the cheeks, which in turn caused Matthew to smile as he watched her walk away. Oh! He exclaimed abruptly, which caused Kaylyn to stop in her tracks. She turned to him with a questioning look on her face. "My driver is outside. I asked him to drive you guys to your desired destinations. It's safer that way," he informed before clearing his throat. Kaylyn smiled and nodded. "Thank you," she said to him for the second time, then left the room. Sapphire smiled and waved from the door as she watched them depart from the house. She then closed the door and turned to Matthew. "Are you ready, Dad?" she asked, moving closer to her father. Matthew was already dialing a number. He held up an index finger in Sapphire's direction, as an indication of pause. "You guys can come over now," he spoke on the other end. "And make sure that you have the manpower to complete everything by 6. Okay, good. See you." He disconnected the call and winked at Sapphire. "They'll be by in a few." Sapphire grinned. "I can't wait to know what Kaylyn thinks. I hope she likes." Matthew nodded. "I hope so too, Pumpkin." "Do you know that you're literally glowing?" Faith exclaimed when they were both strolling through a baby store in the city. Kaylyn blushed. "You exaggerate. Like seriously." "I don't know if it's the baby, or love," she said dreamily. "Ha!" Kaylyn choked. "What gave you that idea?" she asked, pretending to be focusing on some clothes. "Girl, you know you can't hide anything from me," Faith said, rolling her eyes. "So when did you know?" "Know what?" Kaylyn laughed. "That you're in love," Faith answered dreamily. Kaylyn snickered. "I'm not!" she exclaimed abruptly, trying to distract herself from Faith's eyes by pretending to look at more clothes. Faith huffed out an unconvinced breath. "You're such a liar, but anyway, since all that mushy stuff is making you all shy, I'll change the topic," she said with a faint smile. "How's your dad?" she asked now. The smile slightly waned from Kaylyn's face as she sighed. "He's still not responding to treatment, and he's just getting friendlier by the day." She swallowed the lump that formed in her throat. "I fear I might lose him too soon after finding him again," she croaked and folded her lips. Faith placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Everything will be fine, you just wait and see," she smiled. "Your dad will live to see your baby and others you will have." Kaylyn scoffed as she hung her head to hide her trembling lips when a sudden thought occurred to her. "I might not even live to see my baby," she muttered almost inaudibly. "Come on, Kay, I'm sure that a week from now when you visit the docks, everything will be fine." "You'll see," she consoled, gently massaging Kaylyn's arms. "And plus, you have me." "Faith." She smiled, which earned one from Kaylyn. "Thank you." Faith nodded. "Okay, let's get some shopping done. You know, I think you should have really found out the sex of the baby. It makes shopping a whole lot easier." Matthew and Sapphire lay exhausted on the sofa after having finished with what they had set out to do. "I'm tired, Daddy, but I don't want to fall asleep before Kaylyn comes back." Matthew immediately wondered if he should call Kaylyn to find out where she was. After all, it was minutes past 6 and she had been gone since noon. He was about to reach for his phone, when he paused upon hearing laughing outside. "That must be them," he whispered, watching the way Sapphire perked up. His suspicions were confirmed when the door burst open, welcoming Faith and Kaylyn, who bustled through the door with bags in hand. "Kaylyn, you're back!" Sapphire squealed as she dashed towards Kaylyn with a newfound spirit. Kaylyn laughed as Sapphire hugged her legs. "Well, this is what you call a warm welcome. I missed you too, honey." Sapphire beamed in excitement as her gaze drifted to the bags. Can I see? Can I see?" Matthew cleared his throat. "Pumpkin, I'm sure we're all tired, so how about we let that stay till morning?" Sapphire looked a bit confused, but it took her only a moment for realization to dawn. Okay. But I want to help put away the stuff. Sapphire grinned as she grabbed a bag and dashed upstairs. Matthew shrugged as he too took Kaylyn's bag and walked upstairs. What's up with them? Faith whispered. Don't ask me, she muttered as she followed behind. In here. Sapphire peeked out of the room with a grin on her face. Kaylyn's brows knitted in confusion. That's not my room, she murmured to herself as she moved towards Sapphire and Matthew, who was at the doorway. Surprise! They all said in unison, Faith included. Kaylyn's breath caught in her throat when they moved to the side and allowed her a clearer view of the room. She gasped upon seeing the soft white walls with the floral trimmings. A white crib, the one she had told Sapphire she liked, was seated in the middle with two huge stuffed animals resting on the sides. By the window was a wooden rocking chair with a single white cushion strapped to the back and the seat. Subconsciously, Kaylyn's hands went to cover her mouth, when she saw the tiny bookshelf, stacked with children's books. The whole interior was decorated with neutral colors, soft whites and blues, but never giving the impression of a boring space. As her eyes roamed the entire nursery, Kaylyn couldn't help the tears that formed in her eyes. It was simply beautiful. Kaylyn doesn't like it, Sapphire murmured sadly, thinking that her tears were the cause of sadness and not joy. But you can change it. Kaylyn, we just wanted to surprise you, she sniffed, which was accompanied by tears. Kaylyn immediately darted her gaze towards Sapphire, who was crying because she thought Kaylyn didn't like the room. Hey, hey! She knelt down to address her. I absolutely love it, sweetheart. I'm crying because I'm happy, she reassured softly, using her thumb to brush away the tears. Really, she beamed. Kaylyn nodded to confirm her suspicions. I love it so much. Thank you guys, she exclaimed genuinely as she glanced at Matthew and Faith, who were smiling. In the process of standing to properly thank and express her gratefulness, Kaylyn suddenly paused, her mouth slightly opening as her eyes widened. She instantly clutched her stomach, the reaction causing Matthew to immediately rush to her side. Kaylyn, what's wrong? Are you okay? He instantly asked, searching her face. The look of utter shock suddenly transformed to a gasp. I think the baby just moved. She choked out a laugh. It took Matthew a while to really register with what Kaylyn had said. He was too busy wondering if she was hurt, but when realization dawned, his eyes widened and so did his mouth. Are you sure? Matthew blurted, his eyes wildly searching her face then her stomach. Kaylyn laughed. I think so. Matthew subconsciously placed his hand on Kaylyn's stomach, wanting to feel and witness the joy she had earlier experienced. Kaylyn smiled approvingly, the tears welling in her eyes as she feasted her eyes on the sight. Matthew waited for some passing seconds, until he felt what seemed like a throb against her stomach. He darted his gaze to Kaylyn as he gazed at her with incredulity. He laughed a spirited laugh and reached up to Kaylyn, where he pulled her in for a hug, reveling in the joy that he felt. So you really have a baby inside you? Sapphire's voice came with amazement. Kaylyn and Matthew slightly separated as they watched the shock on Sapphire's face. Kaylyn nodded. That's gross. She exclaimed, using her hands to hide her face. Everyone laughed.